Hi, I'm Raleigh Astronomy Club co-chair Doug Lively, and I'll be your host tonight. Welcome to our first Raleigh Astronomy Club virtual club meeting. Tonight, we have Raleigh Astronomy Club member and JPL Solar System Ambassador Mike Keefe, who will present his presentation on the Saturn V, the rocket that took us to the moon. Mike?
So thank you, everybody. I am Mike Keefe. I've been a member of the club for quite a few years, since 2006, I think. I'm also a solar system ambassador. So that is a program that is run through NASA and JPL. And it is basically a way for NASA to meet its actually required mission of educating the public on what NASA is doing. So they take many volunteers across the nation. I think we're up to 750 or more. I know that we've got Doug Lively, who's another SSA, and I believe I saw Ian Hewitt on the line. He's also an SSA. So we get some training, but also bring our own expertise and idiosyncrasies to helping promote astronomy, space exploration, and really kind of part of NASA's mission. So some of this I got from other SSAs. I've looked around. Some of it came from NASA. So what I'm going to talk about today is really just about the Saturn V, the actual rocket that took us to the moon. And although a lot of people think, oh yeah, that's last year's news, we're still kind of in that 50th anniversary of all the Apollo missions. So I think it's still very, very relevant today for celebrating that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started with that.
I don't think I quite hear the sound coming out, Mike. Let's see.
Okay, I know exactly what I did. So let me stop the share. And I will
share that sound and audio.
Yep, I always forget to do that.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Climb the highest mountain.
Perfect.
535. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Sorry, that was my fault.
To go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
So I really love that speech, and I'm sure we could all debate on how politicized that was versus, the actual true scientific nature of exploration. But nonetheless, it was speeches like those that really energized and moved a country to pursue those goals. I, for one, did not live through that time, but having spoken to others and to just see the huge paradigm shift that happened between what we could do in the late 1950s to then actually landing, not just a man, but landing many men, or at least 12, really kind of break it up into some of its larger component pieces. So the first one is what we call basically the first stage. It's also known as the S1C if it's in its Saturn V configuration, but that's where really kind of that's its largest mass portion. That's where its biggest engines are and most of its fuel is located. Then we jump to the S2, or the second stage. Jump to the third stage. Funny though, you would say, oh, well, that's the S3, right? No, it's the S4B. Go figure that one out. Then we'll talk a little bit about something called the instrument ring. And if anyone's had an opportunity or will get the opportunity to visit Johnson Space Center, I believe they have one of these on display, and it's absolutely amazing to think about what it did back over 50 years ago. Then we actually have the spacecraft. So this is the thing that actually gets you to the moon. Ultimately, then we have the launch escape system as well. So those are the major components that we'll talk about, and I'll dive deeper into that. But first, really the awesome process of actually lifting off. So as we kind of go through these explanations of what these things are, think about, literally almost of this rocket as the life cycle of the rocket. So here we're going to go through its first stage of life, which is liftoff.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Sorry. So yeah, what we saw basically was that that takeoff, and that's a 7.5 million pounds of thrust launching a 6 million pound rocket into the sky. And yes, that was ice. Within that, the Saturn V, you actually have these hyperbolic fuels that have to be kept at such a cold temperature that for them to stay liquid, and almost immediately, as soon as you actually release the the fuel hoses and everything, it starts to evaporate. So that is actually ice, and it's just so cold, and that humidity and everything is caking on there. But that first stage is amazing. 138 feet long. It's 33 feet in diameter. And it had 2 tanks of fuel. You had your actual rocket fuel or rocket propellant, that was just RP1 kerosene, as well as you had the oxidizer. You had to actually bring your oxidizer with you to burn it, and that's the liquid oxygen. And you couldn't have those all together, so you had to have them separate tanks. And that fuel from the liquid oxygen tank actually piped through the kerosene. And this rocket, empty, only weighed under 300,000 pounds. Yet when you put all that fuel in it, it was over 5 million. So I mean, when they say all you're doing is really just pushing a bunch of fuel into space, that's what you're doing. You've got to carry so much more fuel than you can actually payload. And it used 5 F1 engines, the most powerful rocket engines ever built. And this first stage was actually built by Boeing. One thing to take a look at, if you look down towards the bottom, you'll see my little plucky astronaut there to scale into this rendering. So he's really tiny. He's not even half the size of the F1 engines. And he'll make an appearance in each of these renderings as well. So the F1 engine is just absolutely remarkable how much thrust it put out, and the engineering that went into actually making sure that these things were viable. There were times where you basically had the combustion right there at the engine. A lot of times it was like this candle effect where it flickered back and forth, and it would cause so much vibrations, and it'd be happening so many thousand times a second that at first these F1 engines kept blowing up. And it was really just through brute engineering, immense creativity, and just the intelligence of these people figured out in slide rules. I mean, they didn't have computer modeling systems to figure this out, but they figured out a way to make sure that that combustion piece, you didn't get that oscillation effect, which again would cause originally these F1 engines to just blow up and explode. And this thing seriously consumed a lot of fuel. So a lot of people try and talk about Okay, how about now? Yeah, sorry, for some reason my headset disconnected. So I think I was talking about the fuel. And a lot of people, you'll often hear things quoted in a number of Olympic swimming pools full of volume this thing would go through in a second. I like to put that in something that I can actually quantify. So if we think about a case of a can of soda or a case of beer, it actually would drink through 33,000 cans of soda per second. So that's a thirsty engine. All right, so now we're going to talk about, the next piece of what we're going to talk about is really what happens right at the end of first stage and into second stage ignition.
Set 8 miles downrange, 12 miles high. Velocity 4,000 feet.
Stand by for mode 1 Charlie.
So at this point,
Stand by for mode 1, Charlie.
we're still not even 2 minutes and 40
Staging status
seconds
booster.
into the
Go.
lifespan of this
Fido.
rocket.
Go. Guidance. Go. Good for staging, Captain.
Ship Charlesworth taking a staging status. This is Houston. You are go for staging. Inboard cutoff. Inboard engines out. I'm inboard.
Confirm inboard. Roger.
Downrange 35
IUE
miles,
now.
30 miles
Go
high.
flight.
Standing by
GNC.
for the outboard engine cut.
Or go flight. Roger.
Staging. And again.
Cut off. Ignition. Roger. Trajectory verify. Roger. Thrusters go all engines. Looks good, Capcom.
11 Houston, thrusters go, all engines, you're looking good. Hi, Roger, you're loud and clear, Houston.
And obviously, there's no sound in outer space because there's no air for the sound waves to bounce off of. So really what just happened, so if we think about our lovely, and then Doug, you might have to yell at me if I'm not in the camera frame. I lost my cameraman.
That's okay.
So we have our model here. So at this point, we've launched, and we're now heading up towards a parking orbit. And all we've done is now just taken and gotten rid of the extra weight. So the fuel has all burned through this entire piece. So what was, almost 600,000 pounds is, 6 million pounds, or sorry, 5.1 million pounds is now just empty. We don't need it anymore. Drop it, let it go. So if you think about that lifespan of this entire piece, it was 2 minutes and 41 seconds. Ignite the second stage and start going. You saw that photograph. Interestingly enough, there were no cameras in that Apollo 11 launch. That footage, that iconic footage you always see of things separating, were actually from the unmanned Saturn V launches, I think 4, 5, and 6. And they did that because of weight savings. Again, when they went to on 11 and the other ones, was complete. They were trying to save every ounce of weight they could. So they didn't even have cameras on there, especially when it's not like you had a remote feed into the cameras. They were actually very, very lucky to recover the cameras that actually came off of, and you can see that separation because they just fell to Earth, and it was, again, just by happenstance, but by luck that they were able to get that. So now we've started our second stage ignition, and we're actually still climbing. At this point, just about I think it's a couple seconds after we've started the second stage ignition, they no longer need the launch escape system. So that basically just kind of is shed off. And for the first time, the astronauts now have a window. Up until this point, it has always been my understanding, they are in the dark. They cannot see out any windows once that launch escape system is in place. So now they finally have a nice view of things. I'm gonna go back to sharing here.
Hey, Mike, we've got a few questions. I don't know if you want to take questions now. Or...
Yeah, we can do that. So
yeah. So so back from the, I'm not sure if you're reading the chat. I can read it out to you.
Yep, that'd be good.
So one of the first questions is that we have is that is that really ice that we see falling off the rocket? I know some other folks have concurred that it is, but I don't know if you wanted to kind of maybe explain that in further detail about from that first stage liftoff, all the shedding of ice and everything that we see off that stage.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think it's just as pointed. It's humidity, it's moisture that's on the rocket, and you've got these fuels, and we'll talk about it in this next part of the S2. You had these hyperbolic fuels. One needed to be, we're talking at 150 or 200 degrees below zero. Another one around 400 below zero. That's what you had to keep these frozen, or you had to keep the temperature down there. Otherwise, they would just evaporate. So it literally is it's so cold that's what's happening. And you often will see some of that evaporation of that fuel actually happening as well. But yeah, it is just so cold that it is it's just moisture forming and the ice falling.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Another question we had was with respect to the actual F1 engine itself.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of explosions due to vibration. Do you want to go any further into that, or?
Yeah. So in fact, the first 3 Saturn V launches were unmanned. As my understanding is that the severity of what they call pogo, which in other words, you didn't have this completely stable, kind of, not that there was ever a smooth ride, but the vibrations were so harsh that an astronaut would not have survived the jolting nature of that launch. So it definitely, it was not a nice, smooth, automatic transmission into outer space. It was a very violent, and they were continuously, massaging those engines. In fact, it's been said you could not build that same engine today with as many in its format that it was back in the 60s, because even though we might have the specs today, so much machining and individual tinkering and fabrication was done to each one of those engines, and at that point the engineers didn't keep very, very specific notes on exactly what was changed. So today we don't have the skills or the workmanship to actually build that engine the way it was built back then. It's been said we could actually take it from some 5,000 moving parts or 5,000 parts of each F1 engine, and you could do it in 500 nowadays. In fact, they were going to do the next version of the F1 engine for the SLS, but it actually turned out to be cheaper to go ahead and use the proven shuttle engines plus solid rocket boosters.
Mm-hmm. Oh, excellent. Another question we had was that, given, the intense heat and everything of the coming off the first stage, was the paint ever burned off the rocket? Or is there any evidence of that?
That's a very, very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think we might have to open it up at a later point and see if anyone does have that. What I can tell you, because of that severe heat and everything coming off, especially at launch, during that first initial launch sequence, you see a lot of things kind of, as the rocket goes up, you see what they call the hold down arms. They'll kind of go up, and then these little covers go over things. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of protection put in place so that the heat from the engines would not destroy the launch pad. And a lot of times you also see a whole bunch of water being dumped in there as well. And people think, oh yeah, that's right. So, don't start any fires. No, it's sound suppression. Because if you didn't have that sound suppression to keep the sound waves in check, basically the sound vibrations from those F1 engines would actually shake the entire launch pad to pieces.
Yeah, pardon. Right, exactly.
So,
yeah. Great, good answer. In terms of the actual rocket itself, the Saturn V, is that actually the largest rocket, or is there one on the Russian side that's larger, or in terms of rockets?
Not that flew.
Good point.
Not that flew. I mean, there were other designs that were bigger. In fact, the Saturn V is actually a scaled down version of what they initially wanted to go to space with. So, but as far as rockets that have actually flown, there is no other rocket that has flown that is more powerful than the Saturn V in terms of just getting raw tonnage into orbit. Now, SLS at some point, I think in a different configuration, not the initial one, but further configuration should actually eclipse its cargo capacity. But again, as far as that has flown successfully, nothing.
Okay. All right, and then I see there's one other question about we mentioned explosive bolts, I think, on some of the intermediary rings. Do you want to go into what those actually do? I see there's a good answer on this chat, but go ahead if you want to talk about what that is. Yeah.
Yeah. So in a lot of cases, you've got this. We talked about the sheer amount of vibrations and the torture this thing goes through, the entire rocket goes through to get into outer space, but yet you have to at some point have it kind of just effortlessly just kind of separate. Well, and that's where the explosive bolts come in. Right. So yes, that's exactly what they did. Otherwise, there'd be no way for this thing to come apart. And if you didn't have it so incredibly rigid, it would. There's just no way it would even survive, the initial takeoff. It is worth noting that, I don't know if the Russians moon rocket that they had been working on, I know it had some 30 different engines around it, and that might have been a more powerful engine. But one of the biggest problems they had was obviously back then keeping 30 engines all firing in a way and gimbling and all working together without advanced computer systems. That's just not possible. Think about what SpaceX is doing now just with 9 of their Merlin engines. I think they're Merlins, in that configuration. And if you think about the Falcon Heavy, that's using the 27. But the other thing about that is those Russian rockets were built lying down. So the amount of rigidity that had to be put in place so they could then roll it out like this and then tip it up was amazing. So luckily, the design that NASA chose didn't require that. So again, with the explosive bolts, that's something that's a little bit easier to have to separate when you need to, but still has the rigidity it needs to withstand the torture of liftoff.
Super. Well, great. Well, that's all the questions we have right now. If you want to continue on, that'd be great.
Yep. Okay. I think I'm sharing still. So. So here we go on to our second stage, and so this is the same diameter as the first stage, just not as long. I talked about these these fuels that we needed to have in order to continue to boost the payload up into outer space, and they used liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. It is interesting that even though it is a second stage, it was the last of the stages to be designed. And so when you think about it, you have your F1 engine, the first stage, that has a maximum amount of thrust it's going to provide. And as the LEM got heavier, so as the spacecraft above it got heavier, and the third stage, got heavier, you had to take all that, anything that they added up top, they had to subtract out of the second stage. So it had to, continuously got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where they could no longer have 2 separate fuel tanks in the rocket. So what they wound up using is this approach called a common bulkhead. So in other words, instead of 2 completely separate tanks, you've got kind of one tank with just a common bulkhead separating 2 different fuels. So again, you have one fuel at negative 432 degrees, and you have the other fuel at negative 298 degrees. And obviously, if the one that's a whole lot warmer, 125 degrees warmer, warms up the other fuel, it's not going to work for you. Those 5 engines of the second stage aren't going to push you if you're not able to get that reaction between your oxidizer and the liquid helium. And what blows me away is the way that they solved this engineering conundrum is this honeycomb structure that was, in essence, very, very thin. I mean, think about it. You know, it's a quarter of an inch at the very outer edges and only 5 inches at its apex. And the way that they built this was basically using explosives underwater to form the bulkhead. I mean, you know, and again, I still just am in awe of thinking what it took to get that level of design and engineering and the accuracy that had to be done, again, with slide rules and you know pencils. Again, no computer aided design here. So this second stage was built by North American Aviation, and it did use 5 J2 engines. And like I mentioned before, you can see our plucky little astronaut down there. He's starting to get a little bigger compared to the rest of the rocket, but it's still quite daunting in size. As we mentioned, we had the J2 engines on this stage. It happens to be that the J2 also, for some of the early Saturn I flights, they used, instead of F1s, they used the J2s as well. But still a pretty impressive engine here. Okay. So, and we pick up in the movie where we left off. Now, if there are any Star Wars fans here, George Lucas completely ripped off NASA when that first scene as the droids in Star Wars, the one from 1977, sorry, they basically escape off the captured spaceship before the Empire can grab the droids. But that's a complete rip-off, by the way, from George Lucas of this scene. So we're actually in the second stage, and that's the third stage, kind of rocketing off. And so now the second stage is starting to fall into orbit. Or sorry, not into orbit, fall back to Earth. And I love this part because, like, here you can see there is Earth falling away. I'm going to stop the share at that point. So we have our lovely entire second stage going up. So what we just saw in that video was then the second stage and third, or actually the third stage separating from the second stage. So again, now this entire 83 feet long piece of the rocket has now fallen back to Earth. It's expended all its fuel. It's useless. And now this is going to get us up to our parking orbit around Earth and get us the last of the way up into at least a point where, I'm going to put that down, otherwise it will fall. At least now the astronauts, once they get into that orbit, have a chance to actually evaluate the system and do some more checks before they decide to make the decision to go into lunar orbit, or lunar rendezvous. Not even lunar rendezvous, trans-lunar injection. Okay, so that third stage, so this is the S-4B. You can see our plucky astronaut is now getting a little bit bigger. This particular stage only used one J2 rocket. It's also worth noting that this was the only part of the Saturn V that actually was ignited twice. Everything else, one ignition, you're fine. What happened is that entire stage would get you up to that parking orbit. And typically it was just kind of once around the Earth, make sure everything is good, all systems check out. And then it's, kind of off to the moon. So this is the part where its payload, in essence, was just the fuel, and then the spacecraft sitting on top of it. It was built by Douglas Aircraft, and like I said, it did use that one J2 engine. The next part here is this instrument ring, and the model itself doesn't really, that I've got, doesn't really highlight it, but this was an absolute engineering marvel. A lot of times people will think, oh, well, you know, the astronauts controlled everything from their capsule, right? No. Yes, they had instrumentation up there and they could see what was going on, but they were basically, they were on for the, you know, they were there for the ride. They were not doing anything. Everything was controlled from this instrument ring. It housed everything from, you know, guidance, communication, telemetry, you name it. And it's just absolutely amazing what they were able to do. You've got things like rope core memory that's in here. You know, the entire thing was 25 feet in diameter and 3 feet tall, but it was very, very sturdy. And, you know, when you try and think about all the things that it did and compare it just to your cell phone today, you're like, oh my gosh, you know, you know, how much have we advanced in all these years? Look how great we are. True, but as often as my iPhone crashes or anything like that, or I've got to hit restart, or, you know, it gets a glitch, I'm not sure I'd want to take my my iPhone, my tablet, or anything and subject it to the tortures of liftoff, as well as all the radiation this thing and the thing is going to face. So it was pretty impressive what this instrument unit actually did. But it was built by IBM. Okay. And this next part is an animation that I did get special okay from the YouTube artist that put it together to go ahead and show this part. Obviously, there were no cameras in outer space in 1969 for us to film what was actually happening at this point. But basically, you know, we're in that parking orbit, just awaiting the go-ahead to go ahead and say, yep, we're going to go to the moon.
Earth 2 or 3 times and confirming all systems are good, it's time to ignite the third stage one more time for about 6 minutes. We call this the translunar injection. This is what sends us away from the Earth and towards the moon. The S-4B is now completely useless. The spacecraft lunar module adapter panels detach, exposing the lunar module. The command and service module do a complete 180-degree turnaround. The command module must dock with the lunar module and pull it out. In space, temperatures are a lot more extreme. There was a real danger of parts of the spacecraft freezing or other parts getting too hot. To prevent this, the spacecraft was now put into a slow roll so that there was an even heat distribution. This was called
Yeah, so there we have that kind of last piece of the puzzle now moving along. And so we have our little model, and it's important to note that, you know, you're in that parking orbit. We're going around 17,000 plus miles an hour, and just to maintain that that high level or that parking orbit, and then you've got to burn the rest of that fuel so that you can actually make it to the moon by breaking free of Earth's gravity. Although theoretically you really aren't really breaking free of it, but nonetheless, you do have to kind of break out of that orbit. So you're, you know, well over 20, I think it's 25,000 miles an hour. And it basically, now you've spent all that fuel that's sitting in that S-4B. So it's just kind of, you're all just chugging along, and all the diagrams and all the, you know, kind of simulations make it look like it's just kind of sitting there in space, not doing anything. In actuality, it's kind of, no pun intended, rocketing off to the moon. So at that point, and once we break this whole thing apart here, so at that point, we have our lovely little LEM here. So that's sitting there, the rest of the spacecraft. And again, all these things are just moving out there. So all towards the moon, you just kind of use your thrusters, push away a little bit. They would turn the spacecraft around, and then engage the thrusters again, and just kind of very gently dock, and then you'd pull it out. And you basically kind of spent the whole way going to the moon, actually going backwards, and they did go into that roll. The astronauts did call that lovingly the barbecue roll. So making sure you kind of cook the pig nice and evenly all the way through and across. So that is what took us to the moon. And when you think about it, all these pieces here that we're dealing with here, none of this really went to the moon. This is the spacecraft that went to the moon. This is all what just kind of got us there, or helped get us there. It is worth noting that the S-4B, although in the first few times they went to the moon, it was basically just kind of jettisoned off, so you wouldn't wind up actually potentially having any sort of contact, and it wouldn't follow you to the moon. They actually just kind of pushed it off to the side, and they've actually tracked a few of these. They're still going around the sun. At times they come back in and get some weird funky orbits, and they'll actually orbit the Earth a few times and then get flung back out, and but they found a few of these actually still in orbit around the sun somewhere. In later missions, they actually took the S-4B and they crash landed on the moon. And the reason they did that was the Apollo missions, when they landed, they all left seismographs on the surface. So one way they could gain a better understanding as to what's going on with the surface of the moon was to, in essence, ring the bell. You figure when you get those, when you have a earthquake or anything here on Earth, the seismographs and those vibrations and how those come across, and they're read by seismographs, tell us a lot about the interior of our own planet. Same thing with the moon. So in essence, the moon is the bell, and the S-4B was the hammer, and they basically rang the moon. And that's how they learned a lot about the interior. Okay. So lastly, we've got our Apollo spacecraft. So this really is all that went to the moon. And in total, it's made up of the service module, which is kind of that kind of very bottom piece with the rocket on it. Then you have the command module, which is in essence, it's the I'm losing my mind. I can't remember the name. The capsule, and then you actually have the LEM, or the lunar module, sometimes called the lunar excursion module, which is basically that spider-looking thing that lands. So that's the only part that went to the moon. Combined weight of a total of 100,000 pounds. So out of that 6 million pound behemoth that we call the Saturn V, only 100,000 pounds actually went to the moon. The rest of it, literally by 3 hours into the mission, everything's now scrap. It's not worth anything. It's been either discarded and burning up back and re-entry into Earth, or they're sending it crashing into the moon. And this is all that's left. So the service module and command module were built by North American Aviation, and Grumman built the LEM. On that. And then here are a few final highlights of a typical, not that any one of them was typical, but of an Apollo mission.
Go forward.
We confirm the separation.
Oh, loud and clear now, Mike, and we understand that you are docked.
That's right. TV looks really great.
11, you got a pretty big audience. It was right perfect.
Sidewind your Diamondback.
Roger, how does it look? The Eagle has wings.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, you're looking great.
The Eagle has landed.
And we're getting a picture on the TV. 1, Zion peace for mankind. Okay, ready for me to come out? Decaying in peace for all mankind. Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now. Magnificent desolation. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man. Houston, Roger, well done. Arm asset, proceed. Very quiet ride. Everything's looking good. I have LIM AOS. Okay, we're all yours. Hey, you're right. Tell to open up the LRL doors, Charlie. Roger, we got you coming home. Good night from Apollo 11.
Orion 3 reported a visual contact.
Michael is 441.
That is on the way up.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Okay.
We can.
So, Doug, if you want to unmute some people, we're going to have a little trivia time.
All right. Well, we'll experiment with unmuting all for now. Let's see how it goes. All right, here we go.
Okay. Does anybody know how many Saturn V launches there were in total? So, and what I mean by Saturn V is not just Apollo, but when the Saturn V in its formation, with the S-4B, the S2, and the S1C. I think I just did that correctly. That whole configuration launched.
13.
13?
22. How about 8?
17.
17. 13 is, I think someone says, is that Ann?
All right, it was Julie, I think.
It wasn't
Okay.
me.
Yeah.
No.
No, so it's 13. So you had the first, the three, so Saturn or Apollo 4, 5, and 6 were unmanned. So those count, and you had all the way up to Apollo 17. And then you had also the Skylab mission, as well as a joint U.S. and Russian mission that all used the Saturn V stack. So, how many people have walked on the moon?
12.
All right, I heard that was first one. First one was 12. Good. All right, how tall? Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was saying good. I got it.
Yeah. How tall is the full Saturn V stack? Yeah, the Lego one's that high. Any guesses? Sorry, I couldn't hear that. Someone.
363.
Awesome. Yep. Nailed that. That sounded like Faith.
I'm not using Google, I promise.
Okay. And how many total engines were on the complete Saturn V stack?
Telescope connected.
14.
I heard 13.
14.
14.
11.
Way off. Way off. 7. Way off.
Escape. 3.
11.
11.
16.
16. All right, so we have the 5 F1s plus the 5 J2s on the second, another J2, so that's 10. You had the rocket on the service module, that engine. Then you have the 2 on the LEM, one that lands, one that takes off, and you have a ton of other rocket motors and ullage motors, retro rockets, the whole 9 yards. So I've counted somewhere in the neighborhood I've heard officially 77, but in some of the documentation I've actually tried to look at, I've counted 83, so somewhere in between that.
Wow.
And even in the launch escape system, you had 3 rocket motors, so when that thing kind of came off. So yeah, and I've even been told don't even bother counting the explosive bolts. All right, so that is it for my presentations. Are there any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did the later missions extend their missions? How did they get more weight, I guess, able to carry more weight than the first couple of missions? They were a lot longer than the first couple of missions.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly for a fact, but when you think about all the redundancies they put in place just in case, they expended a whole lot more fuel, on Apollo 11 when they landed. So a lot of it had more to do with the total weight of the LEM and that sort of thing, and less to do about the total weight of the rocket. So I think, at certain point, I think they were able to remove some of the redundancies and take away some of the, kind of the extras they were holding.
Let me interject, because that was exactly to your point. The LEM itself kept changing its design, because the very first one, the landing pads were like really wide, because they didn't know if they were actually going to land on ice, and that was going to break through the ice. So they needed something that could pretty well float, or if it's going to sink in the sand or whatever. So it was is that they didn't have to have all that redundancy, like Mike said, on LEM. So they were able to reduce quite a bit of weight as they redesigned that. Yeah. So yeah.
Get pictures with APT.
All right.
Exposure canceled.
Right. Does anyone else have any more questions for Mike? Looks like
so. Just kind of looking through the chat. So the Saturn V instrument unit at the Smithsonian Air and Space near Dulles. Very cool to see. It's in the same room as in the shuttle. Okay, so cool. I think that's the Udvar Haley Museum. Just kind of looking through for some questions. Anything else?
There's one here about Apollo 4 I don't know if you picked up on that one.
Not yet. What was the question?
It just says, does that include Apollo Soyuz? So
Yep, that was the first question on how many Saturn V launches there have been.
Oh yeah.
Yep. I don't know if it was mentioned, but how did they keep the liquid hydrogen and oxygen at these cold temperature levels? They kept feeding it in, and they kept pumping it in and pumping it in. I don't know if it was actually extracted or not, or how they did it, but I mean, they had these huge reservoirs on the launch, at the launch site, and they just, I mean, it was connected and feeding, and they were continuously topping it off. So I don't think that they did do a perfect job keeping it cool because it was continuing to continuously evaporating. I was just topping it off. All right. Okay, well, I will stop the share.
Oh, sounds great. And
thank you so very much for the opportunity to present.
Mike, thank you for an awesome presentation. If you'd like to learn more about astronomy or the Raleigh Astronomy Club, please check out our website at www.raleighastro.org or follow us on Facebook. I'm your host, Doug Lively, wishing you all clear skies in the nights to come. Good night.